Now that I've bought my nice light, I've been turning it over in my head, the idea of like one source being able to do it all. Now that I'm building out my kit, I will have access to one moderate to low range light for a while. It's 150 watts, so it's not startlingly bright, nor is it pathetic. I'm in a context where I'm about to shoot something at the end of the month that I would like to have one large source that I can use multi-purpose for a lot of things, because we talked about using large sources as a learning exercise, a learning experience. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think with the fixture that I've been given by the gods, I will be moving between several small sources, setup by setup, that have a consistent look to keep the diffuse ratio 2-to-1 or over. So I just wanted to ask about the general technicalities of source shape, size, and distance, and how that works with the output of the fixture. Can one source do it all in that context?
I think it's, as very often is the case, several questions in one. Let's first go back to basics and separate source and fixture. The source is what the subject sees. Light fixture is some kind of powered device that creates illumination.
Yeah, for the listeners, if you're diffusing a light, the fixture, the actual light itself, the device, isn't the source if you're pointing it at a wall or passing it through a sheet. Once you push the illumination through something or off something, the something that it's passing through or off is the source, if that makes any sense at all. There's actually a much worse way of putting it than how Kim just did it.
Well, I guess
But it's
we'll
any way of
find
putting
out.
it. We will.
So I think, again, it's a matter of kind of flipping the question rather than starting with the piece of equipment, work backwards from what we want to achieve and what do we need our equipment to be able to do to be able to achieve that.
Right.
What we call a single source aesthetic. So that's the sense, the feeling that there is one major light source in the scene that illuminates the setup. It doesn't necessarily have to be achieved through a single source.
I was about to say I'm sure if a single source aesthetic only used a single source, it would be a lot darker than what most single source aesthetics look like.
The first place where we usually see the actual achievement of a single source aesthetic breaking away from being, strictly speaking, a single source is the need for fill light. And then the next question is a question of how do we treat the backgrounds?
That's another whole conundrum.
How concerned are we with the separation of subject and background?
I'm always concerned with the separation most of the time. I don't know if it's just because I've only had the whole lighting the background, like depth lighting concept hammered into me very recently, so it's probably just a lot more fresh in my brain. That adds a whole new layer to my conundrum. As we're talking right now, what's good is that I'm having a few potentially incredibly incorrect light bulb moments that I'll run through later when we get through what we're actually trying to achieve.
Right, so then you have potentially 4 functions or 4 sources that you may need. So there's the key light, the main light, there's the fill light, there's a potential background light, and there's a potential backlight. And I think it is a kind of, I guess, project by project, shot by shot kind of decision how many of those do we need. So in some ways we can think of this as an extension of the 3-point lighting setup, so it becomes a 4-point. So the 4th additional point to the traditional 3-point lighting setup would be the background light. And I would very much pay attention to that if you want to avoid a kind of, let's call it, ambitious YouTuber kind of look.
Good stuff. I'm glad, because I'm glad the YouTube look thing is kind of catching on, because that's my primary thing I want to avoid. I'm going to be trapped in that hole for a while. I know it for a fact. That makes sense. I know what you're saying. The ambitious YouTube look, where they're saying we have a bunch of lights and we know we need to use them on the subject, but the sort of lack of depth awareness, the whole space.
Well, I'm thinking more a trend that I have been seeing. There are YouTubers, educational filmmaking channels who are driving towards, I guess, a more high-end kind of look with a bigger key light source. However, they're not always too concerned about lighting the environment, the background. They're not always too concerned about the fill light.
There is one example I can think of. When I was introduced to the idea of lighting the environment and the background, he had a lamp in the background and turned it on. And I was like, okay, that's excellent. He's using it practical as the depth lighting. That was pretty enlightening. And I think that kind of bucked the trends that you see in a lot of other videos. I don't know if I've seen the same thing as you, because most educational, like cinematography, like lighting focused channels I've seen have had a pretty decent environment and or background lighting focus at the moment, but I can only really think of 2 examples. So my sample space might be 4.
So yeah, if you look at a lot of my overall impression, shadows are very, very dense.
Yes, I think that is a trendy look as well now, I think.
Yeah, so it's kind of given like a Caravaggio type where you get very little separation or no separation whatsoever.
I'm seeing what you mean now. I'm just scrolling through. So if we're talking about one available source and creating a feeling of separation, my immediate knee-jerk reaction to that is it probably isn't going to happen. Like most of the separation might come from the camera angle instead. If that makes any sense, I think that in a one source scenario like mine, most of the perception of the background, like the heavy lifting, will be done by the camera angle and probably not the lights. The way I'm thinking right now is that my priority is the key light. Wait a minute, hang on. I have one fixture. Does that mean I can only have one source? Because I'm thinking automatically that is yes. But bounce counts as a source. Like soft technical term for it. It's not indirect fill, is it? It's something else. Incidental?
Passive.
Incidental fill? Anyway, passive, that's it. That's a source. So I can have 2 sources, but they're both the subject. I don't think passive sources will do much for the background if I'm focusing so much on my subject. I'm saying too many things that could be wrong. Please keep talking so I stop potentially humiliating myself on camera.
Passive fill, so that would be something like a matte white surface that we're using to bounce the light. Drawbacks to that with if your key light, if your main source is soft, is that you're not necessarily going to be able to redirect much light because that main source is kind of going everywhere. So a lot of that light coming from your main source, your key source, isn't actually going to land on your bounce, on your passive fill. So I guess the way I think of it is thinking of like, how much am I returning? How much am I bouncing back? With a harder source, a more directional source, you can kind of concentrate more of that output onto the bounce. And so you return more of that output onto the subject, if that makes sense. Whereas with a passive fill, there is limited amount that you're going to catch in the first place, which means it's limited amounts that you're going to be able to bounce or return back to the subject. So if I try and put this up, like, so it's still inside frame, can you see I'm getting a fair bit of that return on my shadow side here, right? So what I'm looking at here now, right now, can you see my arm isn't quite stretched out?
Yep.
So my fingertips are now touching my softbox key light source. So that's how close it is.
Damn.
Right. So watch what happens.
I can't even.
So watch what happens to that return that I'm getting as I start moving this away. So that's like moving it 2 inches. So if I move it another foot, that's another foot.
That's a conundrum that I faced like a lot. I've shot like a fair bit outside, and whenever I've used like obligatory bounce to, fill in the shadows, almost every single time I do it, especially on the fly, I'll, put the bounce where I like it, look at the subject's face and be like, that looks fantastic. Look at the camera and go, that looks fantastic. And then be like, oh, it's on camera. Never mind. It's like completely on camera. I'll move it off camera and it's almost pointless. Almost. I still do it, but it feels very pointless at a certain point. Like I almost do it out of safety instead of knowing that it's making a difference.
Right. So there is a way with a soft main source to get a little bit more. It does have drawbacks, but this is where shiny, like a reflector rather than a bounce, will give you a bit more output. It will also give you a bit more direction, so you have to be more careful about where you place it.
Yeah.
But yeah, just think of it as in for passive repurposing, I suppose you can call it. If the source that you're trying to catch, so to speak, is soft, you're going to catch less of it because it radiates light in a much wider cone than a harder light. So think of it like a shower head. Okay, if you've got a narrower spray and you have a bowl and you try and catch water, you're more than likely to catch all of the water coming out of that shower head, right? If you take the same size of bowl, but your shower head have a much wider spread, you're going to catch a smaller arc, a smaller cone, a smaller percentage of those droplets.
And that's kind of the difference between a very directional hard source and a fairly soft bounce / diffused / both source.
Yeah.
And also in that context, the difference between a matte white bounce and a shiny.
You do have some options. But one, if the cone of spreading illumination from a softer source is wider, then if you catch it from more angles, i.e. a wider wider bounce, then you are going to be able to redirect more light. So yeah, I've used 12-foot by 12-foot reflectors outdoors.
Shinies? Like wow.
Yeah.
Is that a safety hazard?
Yes.
Wouldn't they get real hot?
No, that's not so much the problem. It's more like it's a giant sail.
Right. Yeah, of course.
In terms of bounce, yeah, I ages actually since I shot day exteriors, but last time I did, I had 3 8-foot by 6-foot bounces. So again, if you consider trusty bounce again, you consider like tracing the angles from the source. So if I want to pull this further back and I want to catch as wide a cone of light coming from my soft source, then the further back I pull it, the wider it needs to be to cover the same cone.
Yeah.
Hence, almost like a little curve. Get something like
That's fair,
a medium long shot or a head to toe wide shot.
It sounds to me like life is made a lot easier the larger your sources and your passive sources are.
Well, I think
generally.
it's the same as trying to shape soft light. A small cutter like 18 by 24 inch isn't really going to do anything for 12 foot by 12 foot. You really start looking at like a 4 by floppy or something even bigger to start thinking about properly cutting that.
No, I'm agreeing. Like I haven't used like a 2 by 2 to cut soft light before and then been like, oh, that looks good. And then realized it made absolutely no difference at all.
All it really does is cut down on the output.
Yeah. I mean, it did that. It didn't shape it very well, but did something.
Let me see here. Alrighty. So my softbox is just ever so slightly bigger than this foam board. So if I try to flag this one, then you see, does it really cut it or does it just reduce the output?
Yeah, it's just reducing output. It's just making you darker. My second big question is a very long and roundabout one. If we're just talking about key light, mentally, my solution to the one moderately weak fixture equals not very far away, not very big source, that conundrum, my solution to that is to match the diffuse ratio and direction of what would otherwise be a very big source with a smaller source and move that around setup by setup. And it got me thinking, what is the difference between a one-size-fits-all large source that is a, like, let's say it's a book light 2-to-1 diffuse ratio to our subject. It's 8 feet by 10 feet. Let's say it's 10 feet wide and it's 5 feet away from our subject. What's the difference between that in the final image and what I will probably end up using being like a smaller pseudo book light 2 meters wide that is a meter away from our subject? Like, my assumption is that the larger source makes more sense practically and could be used with less fiddling in between setups. That's all I can think of right now. But visually, what is the difference between those sources if the only difference is their size and distance, not their diffuse ratio or anything? Is it the fall off?
Right. I think I heard the magic F word. Did I hear the magic F word?
Maybe. I certainly won't repeat it. Is it fall off? Was I right? Excellent. Okay, good. Fall off is I think in my lighting, my internal lighting knowledge is probably the one term that I have the most undefined understanding of, if that makes sense. Like I have a very basic understanding of what it means, but I know that it's probably wrong if I put it to words. My understanding of it is like the rate at which light turns to shadow on a face or an object, but I can't really visualize the differences. Whenever I've had a look at photos that have compared it, I haven't been able to quite tell. Like it's not something that's innate yet to me.
Two questions here we need to untangle.
Excellent.
I want to backtrack a little bit. Where does your notion come from that your fixture is underpowered?
But not only is it the fact that like relative to the okay, I think that maybe we're going to expose a really fundamental misunderstanding of how electricity and light works. Number one, at full power, using a very makeshift booklight during my tests, I was after 100-foot candles from my source. I actually don't know if that's a lot to ask of a source, but I was just using 100, 100, 2.8 as a reference, and I've got stuck on 100-foot candles. And with a booklight that was a meter or a meter and a half away from me, it had to be at full power to hit 100-foot candles, and I had to make some modifications to the distance and all that. It was actually in that context a bit harder to get the correct amount of foot candles that I wanted, which kind of gave me the impression it was underpowered, because I'm more used to turning on a source and going, that's too bright, and turning all the settings on the camera down. It's the first time I've had to kind of work around the source as well as the settings on the camera. Again, that is a super isolated experience that could simply have just formed into a bunch of horribly misinformed preconceptions about the way lights should work, but that's my reference point. It didn't feel as powerful as other sources that I've used. That's it.
But when was the last time in an actual production that you shot for 100-foot candles?
I can't remember off the top of my head. I could pull up my old exposure calculations for the library we shot in for the other short. I might have been winging it for that. I might have been eyeing it. I don't think I was. I think it's worth me just saying I don't actually remember. I haven't memorized the calculations I did. I shot a lot outside. The only time the last time I can remember shooting for 100-foot candles is probably during camera tests that we did at JMC. I don't know what amount of light I needed for inverse, but it definitely terrible question to ask someone with a very poor memory. You should know this by now. Whenever we finish an episode and you ask me to summarize, I go, what? Sorry, I've been playing a Family Guy episode in my head for the entire recording process. I don't know what we talked about.
So I think let's go back to exposure for a little bit. For me, part of the whole purpose of lighting to a stop versus chasing the light is to be in control. So if we are going to light to a stop, then we make prior decisions on ISO, shutter speed, and stop, right?
Yeah, which is what I kind of did when I tested my light out. Why did I say kind of? I did. I don't know why I'm saying kind of, like I faked it.
But why 100 ISO?
That's a great question. It hung around. I simply used 100, 100, 2.8 as my reference, as I always do, and I made adjustments on my camera to compensate for its settings, and I didn't have to adjust the light.
So how do we choose ISO?
Put it in. I know it's much more
What's our parameters for choosing ISO?
I know it's a lot more complicated than how I see it, and I definitely used ISO more strategically and with more understanding when I shot my short. For the past 6 months, whenever I've tested anything, ISO has been just it's the dumb beginner approach to it that I've been using. Just the keep it low, bump it up if necessary, which I realize is not how it works. So let's just shorten that answer to your question of how do we use ISO to I used to know better, but now I don't. Your turn.
So, do you remember the concept of native ISO of cameras?
I do. And it's something that I hear about a lot and absorb, and then it leaves. It's something that I think still kind of confuses me technically. And whenever I'm kind of baffled about something technically, it doesn't retain very well in my brain.
To keep it simple for now, because ISO is
a whole episode's worth of information to discuss on its own.
I'm trying to come up with something clever and witty, and I'm failing abysmally.
No, take your time. We can time lapse this if you want.
I was going to say in search of objectivity, but it's not really. It's more kind of a question of like which objectivity. For now, internet will provide you with the native ISO of most cameras.
I think mine is like we've spoken about it before. I used to have my camera's native ISO memorized, which is ironic because I was back when I barely used it. But it ended up being something very surprising, like 800 or something.
So
this is me saying, please start talking so I don't say something really dumb.
Technicolor considers 320 ISO, like a native, for a lot of cameras that came out in the wake of the 5D Mark II.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the Technicolor CineStyle log profile for Canon cameras?
Yeah, I've got it on my camera. I use it all the time. Excellent.
That's calibrated for 320 ISO.
Well, excellent. I wish I had known that before I used my camera to record a helicopter ride in New Zealand, because now I know that it won't be as perfect as it could have been. Alas. Okay, go on.
Do you want to recalculate your required foot candles for correct exposure at 320 ISO?
Off the top of my head? I'm not doing that off the top of my head. I can't do that off the top of my head. That's 320 is like a bit over a half a stop above 200, and I'll have to think. Okay, a full stop above 200 ISO is 400, right? It just doubles. The way you calculate full stops with ISO and foot candles is that it doubles or it halves. So 100 is a full stop below 200, which is a full stop below 400. And with that knowledge, I am making the assumption that like 320 ISO is something ridiculous, like 0.6 of a stop above 200, which means that I would have to figure out my foot candles given that knowledge to reach correct exposure. And this is where my exposure calculation falls apart, because I'm still functioning properly in like full stops. Otherwise, I have to pull out your Excel spreadsheet to help me out.
Let's go back and be a bit old school, because I think it is worth for the serious cinematographer, for the serious gaffer, to memorize the ISO scale.
Yeah.
It's just going to make life so much easier.
Mm-hmm. You can have a crack. Okay, again, because it doubles, it's 100, 200, 400, 800. Jesus, my maths is terrible. 1600, 3200, and I actually can't see your face right now. So if you're wincing, I can't tell. It continues. It doubles. My impression of it is that it doubles. So I could just keep doubling those numbers, but I know there is some fatal flaw in that assumption that I'm not aware of. So far, so good. However, that doesn't account for the 1/3 increment in between the full stops. Oh, true. Yeah. Again, I think my fallacy is that I like to work in full stops because I'm too scared of 1/3 increments at the moment, which I realize is a bit of a roadblock to my learning. So I'll get a note thing up. Hang on. Well, do you want to bring up a spreadsheet? A spreadsheet. Okay. There's a reason why I'm doing this. Kind of like the f-stop sequence. There's only so many numbers you need to memorize, and then we can just move decimal points after that. The sequence is a recursive sequence. In theory, we can go on into infinity. We've got another you didn't know spreadsheet episode. It's been a while since we've had a spreadsheet episode of you didn't know. Let's try somewhere in the middle, like maybe let's start with column F for now and go 100, then 125, 160, 200, 250, 320, 400, 500, 640, 800. Alrighty. Now we're going to take that exact same row of numbers, but add a 0 to every number. Mm-hmm. And you're going to stick that in column G. Alrighty. Now we're going to go column E. Mm-hmm. And we're going to put the same sequence, but we're going to remove a 0. We're going to move a decimal point. I see. And we could just keep going. Yeah. To infinity and beyond. So there are 10 numbers that you need to memorize. Mm-hmm. We're going to put every third row. So if you just go and highlight the whole row, like the top row. Oh, right. Gotcha. Okay. And bold that. Ah, I see what you're getting at. So that's your whole stops. Emboldened? Is that bolded? Bolded? Opportunity to remind bolded the wide world that my dad is an accountant and I should know how Excel spreadsheets work, but I don't. I never will. So if we look at that then, if we go from 100 to 320, how many stops are we moving? 1 2/3. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
from 100, if we want to go down 1 2/3, where do we end up?
Right. 32?
Yes.
That's
So
funny.
rather than needing 100 foot candles, you then need 32.
Excellent. Given that the aperture is 2.8 in
Yes.
that context.
Now,
Yeah.
do you know what ISO you're going to shoot on for the, what was it, Black Magic Pocket 6K?
I actually don't know. I've yet to figure that out. Do you have a recommendation?
Again, maybe needing to do some research on native ISO.
Fair enough. I need to do some research on that camera for a very long time. I found a very nice 2-hour-long video that to get very cozy to watch.
Maybe even do some tests.
Yeah, it isn't my camera. I had to get it from someone who lives far away. But that is fair enough.
But if you're going to shoot with it time and time again,
I should get familiar with it.
the other thing I want to put out there is wide 2.8.
Again, default. I realize that 2.8 is a pretty unsustainable f-stop to shoot at because it's like
Second?
annoying. 2.8 is wide open is that's wide open on this camera at least. Is a pretty unsustainable f-stop to shoot at in a lot of contexts, I think, especially like an amateur context like mine. That is, again, simply because I read the exposure calculator, the little 100, 2.8 thing that I had memorized and thought, what can I alter? Like I'm always just kind of calculating exposure starting from there. However, now that native ISO is in play, I might be starting from that reference point instead. But I should also start from available light if there is available light. It's a whole song and dance. It's a whole deal. This is another one of those episodes that's going to expose how little I actually know.
For me, depending on the experience of the crew and particularly the experience of the focus puller, personally, I like sitting at an F2 or T2 a lot for depth of field. So that's going to give you another stop of exposure as well.
Yeah. So I need to do my research because I don't know what lens my pal has that he has on his camera. This is where a lot of setting exposure now becomes figuring out how his camera works.
There is a noticeable difference for a focus puller between a 2 and a 2.8. So you got to take that for your little shoots. Have you sorted crew?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, we have a very, very limited kit at the moment, so we may not even have a follow focus. So we'll have a focus puller, but it's going to be someone who probably helps out with the camera. That's really it.
That is something to take into account as well. The other thing that we maybe haven't quite covered, LEDs versus tungsten fixtures. LEDs are more power efficient.
Right.
Like comparing wattage of an LED to the wattage of a tungsten isn't really a one-to-one.
Right. Okay. All right. That clears a lot up. Is it? Okay. All right.
There are a lot of variables, but if I were to give a very, very rough back of the envelope estimate for a Cobb single point source LED versus Fresnel, I'd say you're looking at between 4 to 5 times the efficiency.
Excellent. That's reassuring.
So when you consider all that, like for me, shooting a lot of cameras with 800 ISO T2, I'm then lighting for 6.4 foot candles, which is 16 times less than the target that you were looking at. As a reference as well, like I'm currently on 100 2.8 on my DSLR here. My softbox is currently lamped with, do this by feel, how many globes have I got? One, by a single 45 watt fluorescent globe 2 foot away.
Well,
so I do think you have more. I do think you have more output than you may think.
Excellent. Okay, I'm glad. I might be able to experiment. Like that kind of answers a bit of my question. That means I can probably afford to experiment with slightly larger sources.
I did a test with an equivalent, so that the Mark 1 of the VL150. So do you remember with a hyper reflector and a slightly narrower beam angle than I would prefer for a book light? I kind of worked out a very, very rough estimate of 160 times less than whatever stated at 1 meter. So remember the photometrics? Remember what we're talking about photometrics last episode?
Yeah, in like passing. Like you mentioned that briefly, right? Or was it all about photometrics? I just didn't realize.
I seem to recall someone at the summary of the episode saying, like, output, yes, we know exactly how to do that. We XYZ, whatever.
Oh, testing output. You mean like a meter away from the your reference point is your light's output a meter away from whatever you're testing it with. Okay.
Yeah. So my kind of very rough guideline is for 8x8 book light at a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. if you take the stated foot candle output at 1 meter and divide it by roughly 160, that's how much light you're going to be left with at your subject.
Once it's been passed through an 8x8 foot book light, is what you're saying. At 1:1 ratio.
Now, there are a couple of caveats with that. Number one, I was using bed sheets for both bounce and diffusion.
Right.
So remember,
So
we
you're
were
probably
saying
losing a lot
last
of-
week on a bed sheets, that's a little tip as well. Like you're looking at the kind of 250 thread count bed sheets. It's actually quite similar to muslin.
Yeah, I think I have one of them. It's very handy.
So it's not a very efficient bounce material.
Calico, by the way, that's muslin. That's calico. We've had a whole song and dance with calico. Right,
Yes.
go on. I had to get that out of my brain.
So if I had been using something like Ultra Bounce, I probably wouldn't have gotten as high a denominator, if that makes sense.
I think.
So the denominator, the factor that I'm dividing by.
Right, yeah, because you would have been losing less output and therefore had to divide it by less.
Mm-hmm. Off the top of my head, I think the stated spec, let's just go with it for now. I think the stated spec for the VL150 is something in the region of 4,000 foot candles.
4,000 foot candle output, like with the classic sort of meter away light meter measurement of just the straight fixture. So you want to divide 4,000. If in the context of using it as a fixture for an 8x8 book light that is 8 feet away from the subject, we're dividing it by 160, you said, to figure out the output of that source?
My very rough estimation from that setup I did was about 160 times less.
Okay.
So if I do that calculation, I get 25 foot candles.
Mm-hmm.
I do think you have more output than you may have been concerned about.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting from this is that I think I was under the impression that I needed. Well, not only has the native ISO thing changed everything as usual, I'm sure it changed everything for me 6 months ago, and then I forgot about it, and then it came back. I'm getting the impression that I kind of overestimated how much light I need for an image to look good, and I think I should probably make my camera more open to receiving light. Is a really bad way of putting it, but is the only way I can think of putting it right now. May have kind of deluded myself into prioritizing exposing with the light a little bit more than I need to. It sounds like 25 foot candles actually isn't like a death sentence of a reading, and I would have assumed it was off the cuff for no reason.
I think the other thing that I would take into account as well is you got two soft boxes, and like I said, with this one, like a 45 watt globe at about 2 feet away is giving me good exposure for 100 ISO.
These will at least make good fill light. Like they won't be pathetic. I was kind of expecting them to just like function exclusively as props, but especially if my camera is exposed for like, it will sound like my camera will be exposed for a foot candle reading in the tens, not the hundreds. These will probably be actually like more useful than I thought already.
So are your softboxes like got a screw-in globe, or is it a fixed light-emitting element inside it?
It's a screw-in globe, so I can't always replace it.
So I've also got like an adapter that gives me 5 sockets in one.
Oh, wow. That's excellent. I shall keep that in mind as well. I never think to modify lights. I don't know why. It's something that I hear all the time in like anecdotal stories about big directors of photography making changes to practicals to make them brighter. And I never think of doing it myself.
Fluorescents have got a similar kind of higher efficiency than halogen and tungsten globes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not going to be as punchy, but what I've got here at the moment is this. I don't have the original diffuser on my softbox because I don't know where I put it.
Nice.
So this is a random piece of fabric I bought for testing.
Mm-hmm.
So in effect, I'm using it as a big reflector. So, like that little hyper reflector you've got for your VL150.
Yeah.
In effect, I've got like a softbox sized one.
I do too.
I have a little bit of a think about this. What's the purpose of a book light? What's the benefits of a book light?
I've always figured it was kind of fairly soft light. Like it's not tiny, but it can be used in a small space and it produces decently diffused light given how small it can be. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all source.
And how does it do that?
By passing the light through 2 buffers, basically. Like it bounces off something, then passes through something else.
So in essence, what we're doing, rather than taking a small source, just the front of a light emitting diode or a front of a Fresnel and trying to spread that out over like an 8 foot by 8 foot, we're starting with something that's already bigger.
Yeah.
So in order to get that to fill the next diffusion, we can keep it closer to that diffusion. It doesn't have to be as far away to fill the face of it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess in one way of looking at it is rather than using one small source, try and fill one large source, we're using kind of intermediate size source to fill the biggest modifier.
Yeah, okay. That's a very good way of putting it. That makes a lot more sense.
So this can be quite handy in tight spaces is you start with bigger sources, you can use multiples, and you don't need them as far away.
Multiples? I've lost you on that piece on that terminology. Unless we...
My softbox is 70 by 50 centimeters, that is. So I've used that in the past in a pinch 4 softboxes at a 45-degree angle behind a single 8 foot by 8 foot.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Oh, you can use multiples. Right. Yes. It makes using multiple fixtures a lot easier and a lot easier on the eye.
Not so much that, but it's just that whole principle of taking that intermediate size source, i.e. the bounce, rather than having to start with a much smaller source. So the whole setup has ended up being about as deep as one of these soft boxes at a 45-degree angle.
Yeah, excellent. All right. I have this is one of those situations where after we've had our discussion, I have more to think about than I did before, which is fantastic. Like it's cleared a bunch of things up and opened up a bajillion different more questions. And also reminded me that I need to actually start getting to work on my setups like very, very soon. So I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I do quite a lot. I guess it's a kind of semi-cheat booklight by using like a intermediate size source to light a diffuser.
Yeah.
So a source that I've used a lot is they're like a 4 foot by 2 foot fluorescent source.
Yeah.
Put that behind a 6 foot by 6 foot.
It's a quick booklight, kind of quick cheap booklight.
So you still need to have some distance between them, but in effect, it acts similar to a booklight because you're using a soft light to light the diffusion. So you're using a larger area to start with rather than start with a much smaller pinpoint source that you then have to pull much further back to fill that diffuser evenly.
It's a case of kind of trying your best to matching the size and shape of your diffusion so it lights it more evenly, which is very good in my case, given that my light has an incredible hotspot, which only looked even like way worse when I actually tested it out. That's my number one gripe, but it's decent, whatever. That's good. I'll be probably booklighting the shit out of this, I think. It sounds like a great solution to a hotspot, as well as being very size and distance flexible and efficient. That makes sense.
I would definitely try something like a 5 foot umbrella. I do think, however, that longer term, that a single fixture isn't really going to do it. Like, I think you are going to have to sacrifice either the background light or the separation, i.e. the backlight. Now, there are things you can do here. I mean, you kind of alluded to it yourself, like with the higher ISO, practicals are also going to do more for your background.
Yeah, which is exciting.
Depending on your depth of field, if you can go a little shallower, I would consider some more spotty practicals.
All right. How come?
Some slightly harder practicals. So if you look something like these jobs, so that's one of those gooseneck desk lamps from IKEA, like $20 or $30 or so. They are quite warm, but that would play as actual domestic practical.
Yeah.
I haven't got it plugged in at the moment, so I can't show you the beam, but that would allow you to paint the background light a bit more rather than just wash it.
Which really makes sense with a shallower depth of field, so you can't quite tell if it looks... I'm getting a lot out of this, which is very, very good. I think that God damn it, I've forgotten the entire first half of our conversation. Just give me a second. Because I know what we talked about, but I also don't know how to... Hang on. I've got all the second half completely memorized because it just happened. Give me a key word from the first half of this conversation. I guarantee it will all come flooding back to me.
Damn it. He had to ask, didn't he? Because now I got to try and remember.
Ha! I've a lot out of this. We've just kind of like had a bit of a saunter on through the semi-familiar territory of how to actually cover the scene. My question of how do I light with one source has been answered with you might need 4. The key, the fill, the background, the backlight. It sounds to me like we've mentioned this later, but sacrificing separation might happen, but we will see. We've realized that my entire frame of reference is pretty much wrong, as is my entire frame of reference for ISO. Relearning about native ISO is always fantastic. It gives me a lot more flexibility and wiggle room of exposure to actually play with. Now I know that I actually have the flexibility to use a large but kind of weak source, as you explained with your little denominator, your 160 divide by 160, get 25, you have a functional source situation. And now I know as well, given the native ISO thing, practicals might just work. I was really worried that they just simply wouldn't help me at all. But in certain situations, especially for depth lighting, in a shallow depth of field, they could do the trick, for the moment at least. What is the difference between a very, very big source and a very, very small source that's close if the diffuse ratio is the same? We briefly discussed fall off. We just pushed past the YouTube look and are now at the ambitious YouTube look, or a bit further past that, potentially. We shall see. I could forget all of this and just shoot something that looks like a Smosh video from 2008, which I don't know if the reference you'll get, but hopefully you do. We shall see. Yeah. Great. Excellent. Another lucrative discussion.
Testing.
Yes. Which I need to try and find time to fit into, tear this camera out of my friend's hands and test the living shit out of it with my light. Testing my light and that camera at the same time will be just a wonderful, that'll be a day's work. It'll be excellent.
And yeah, like we said, don't undersell your softboxes.
Yeah.
Once they're behind a sheet of diffusion, then no one knows.
Yeah. At that point, they're cheap book lights, as you just referenced.
When are you shooting?
May the 4th.
What are you calling it? Short, skit, episode?
I don't know. Something. It's 3 minutes long. I think skit is probably the best way of putting it, but I also kind of hate that word for some reason.
Gag?
Gag.
That response was not particularly enthusiastic, was it? I don't think he liked that one.
Sorry. I'm sorry I repeated what you suggested back with incredible revulsion in my voice. I should really control my inflections a little bit better.
I think what we need to test, A, is the size of the output, as in how much can you actually get away with on ISO that you're likely to shoot at.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also worth testing the soft boxes in a soft source.
Yeah.
I think it's worth testing the practicals for background lighting, particularly the slightly spottier ones that you can shape more deliberately.
Mm-hmm. And also compensate with shallow depth of field. So
kind of the reason I was asking about the production schedule for the not quite skit.
The gag.
Are we going to put some stakes on these lighting tests?
I'm changing my workflow a little bit, so I do most of my planning after the director and I have seen the location and been in there.
Mm-hmm. These kind of tests aren't necessarily, this is more like workflow and technique library development, if that makes sense.
I can do a test tomorrow. I can fit that in. I know that I can probably pull off a test tomorrow. I have a whole free day. I need to just do something with my light. I've been trying to figure out what to do.
And what's the stake?
The stake?
The forfeit?
Okay. I'm going on a trip with my friends, and naturally, people have different opinions on movies and stuff. And last time I went on a trip with these friends, they made me watch High School Musical 2 the full way through. And I should work that into my stakes somehow, because there's a lot of High School Musical. There are a lot of Barbie movies and stuff on that trip.
Do we do Bart Simpson's Blackboard style?
Oh, that's cruel. Sure. Yeah, what do you mean? Elaborate?
So if you don't complete your lighting test this week, let's say,
do it like 6 times?
Yeah, you have to post on your socials an image that is filtered to the rim with the 1/3 ISO steps sequence.
Oh my God. Okay. So I just spent an hour just typing out the entire thing, and then just post shitloads of numbers like the Matrix on my account. And then just, hashtag didn't do my homework. By tomorrow, my guarantee is that I will have an image of a properly exposed Ethan face with a background with a shallow depth of field that is also decently exposed with decent practicals. Even if that means I'm just turning my lamp on. Who knows? I'm not entirely sure how well I can shape it, but I just want to get the separation, see how it looks. Mm-hmm. How does that sound?
Okay, sounds good.
Excellent. It's a deal.